Hi, welcome everyone. I'm Rochelle. I head up the Alumni and Development Office at Trinity Hall, and I'm pleased to bring you one of our PaTHways Careers Network events this evening. We've got over 40 people registered, including alumni from a matriculation year of 1961 through to current day students. And we have people registered from 7 different countries. I'll do a quick shout out. Australia, Germany, Singapore, Spain, Switzerland, the USA and the UK. So welcome to you all and thank you for joining us. We're delighted to have 3 of our alumni here this evening, Claire, Ella and Hugh. They all read psychology at Trinity Hall and they're going to talk about their pathway after graduation. But to chair the discussion, I will hand over to our fellow in psychology, Dr. Lee de-Wit. Thank you, Lee.
Thank you very much for the introduction and thanks so much for organising, Rochelle and Elena. I've actually quite recently joined Trinity Hall myself, and I very much like participating in alumni events. It's always very interesting for me to understand what alumni have done with some of the things they learn in psychology in their later career. It helps us think as educators on how to design and develop curriculums to meet future career needs. We've got a range of questions that we're going to go through, which will help think about the pathway that our guests have taken in their career and how that might help you think about your career. But before we go into those questions, we're just going to do a brief personal introduction from everybody. I'm Lee de-Wit. I'm a fellow in psychology and lecturer in the Department of Psychology, and I live here in Cambridge, near to the train station, in a development that may not have existed when many of you studied in Cambridge, one of the modern flats near the station. Okay, so I'll hand over to Claire first to introduce herself.
Hi everyone, I'm Claire Ferguson. I live in the north. I live in York, and I work for the Department for Work and Pensions as a part of their behavioural science team.
Lovely. Hugh?
Hi. Hugh Marston. I'm currently speaking to you from the UK, Southamptonish, but usually I'm based in southern Germany, in a little town called Biberach, where I'm the Senior Vice President and Global of CNS disease research for a major pharmaceutical company called Boehringer Ingelheim. And I think as the evening wears through, you'll find out I'm a bit of a mongrel, but psychology has been a theme that's run through my various different endeavours over my 30 years in neuroscience.
Thanks, Hugh. Ella?
Hi everyone, I'm Ella. I'm in London at the moment and I work for Mind. I'm an education mental health practitioner.
Excellent, thanks. So first off, we're going to start with the educational starting point for your career in psychology. So if you could tell me first about what you studied at undergraduate and what you studied at postgraduate. Maybe we'll go in reverse order if we can start with Ella.
Yeah, sure. So I studied the PBS degree, so psychological and behavioural science, and my postgrad is a diploma in my current role, so education mental health practitioner.
You?
Yeah, so this is where you will begin to see how much of a mongrel I really am. So I actually started off, my first degree was in physiology, pharmacology and computing, and I landed up on a job at Cambridge at the Department of Experimental Psychology as a computer programmer, but found I liked the cognitive aspect sufficiently that I actually then sat through the final year of the Cambridge BSc and then went on and did a PhD in experimental psychology here in Cambridge.
So I actually did my undergraduate degree in Canada, where I did a degree in psychology with of course, in North America, they have the major-minor system. So I did a major in psychology and a minor in history, and then came to Cambridge to do my MPhil in a program that now does not exist, the social and developmental psychology, where I got to have a really fun time combining the two, and definitely enjoyed being the odd one out, because I was doing a topic that was slightly unusual, looking at asylum history.
Okay, thanks. So next thing we're going to ask is whether you knew what you wanted to do when you finished either your undergraduate or your postgraduate. Hugh, I guess you've got a complicated journey, so maybe you want to start on that one.
Yeah, well, hopefully my answer might be useful to you guys that really don't quite know where you're going to go, because I clearly always wanted to do research. That was one thing I did want to do. but I wasn't very sure where I wanted to do it. And I thought about physiology. I applied for various things like that and actually did some work experience in that area. And actually ended up putting myself into a holding pattern for a year while I worked as a computer programmer, which if you look at my year of graduation, that was back in 1984, when computing was somewhat more primitive than it is these days. But actually at that point, I then was able to bring together the fact I was actually very, very interested in the mind, the brain. I was fascinated in the ability to apply technology, but I also wanted to bring my physiology and pharmacology to bear. And that really where I brought all those together. And that's why I landed up doing my PhD in experimental psychology, where I was trying to work out really which bits of the brain went wrong in Alzheimer's disease and how might we fix them. And actually to do that, I needed to know a little bit about what's going wrong in the human brain. I needed to know what was going wrong in the animal brain. I needed to know how to test it and then move it back to the clinic. And that's pretty much been the template for the next 30 years of my career. And that's pretty much what I still do. I've got in my department over 90 people in Germany. I've got 12 psychologists. I've got 8 PhD psychologists, as well as clinical psychologists, psychiatrists, as well as neuroscientists and pharmacologists. So we all work together trying to unravel what's going on in the brain.
Excellent, thanks Hugh. I guess, Claire, as you went on to do a master's, I guess at the end of your undergrad, you weren't necessarily clear about what you wanted to do career-wise. How did that pan out?
I actually did a huge late in my degree pivot where I spent most of, because undergraduate degrees are slightly longer in North America, and I took longer to do mine. So I took 5 years, which puts me 2 more than the average British degree. And I spent about 4 of those years convinced that I was going to go on and do something clinical, that I was going to be a clinical psychologist. And then purely by chance, I happened across some of the work that Juliet Foster was doing out of Cambridge, looking at, she was looking at how we can apply social psychological buildings to historical asylum architecture plans. And it was just an idea that grabbed me and wouldn't let go. So I ended up completely abandoning this plan to go do this sort of insane passion project. And the whole year I was thinking, this is fascinating and it is not going to lead to a job. but it was worth it. And I ultimately ended up working for a healthcare charity, and it was the skills that I developed that I could then argue, even though the subject matter was maybe not relevant in my day-to-day work, the skills that I had learned through my degree still ended up being really relevant. So yeah, no, I had no idea for most of my degree what my long-term plan was.
How about you, Ella?
Yeah, I think for me, it's kind of, the short answer would be yes and no. I think I always knew that I loved psychology. I was really interested in mental health and a lot of the topics that we studied. So I kind of had some idea that was the realm I wanted to be in. But in terms of specific career, absolutely no idea. I went for social work to begin with, didn't get that. Then I explored the idea of research, didn't get that either. So I kind of tried a few different routes until I got to where I wanted to, or where I am now, really. Yeah, and it was a funny one, because in some ways I thought, actually I don't necessarily want to be in mental health, because at the time I had a lot of kind of lived experience of mental health problems in my family. So I was like, right, I don't want to have my whole life mental health oriented, but here I am and I love it. So yeah, I didn't really know exactly what I wanted to do, but things just, I guess they kind of happen sometimes, don't they? Yeah.
So moving on to the next question. So how did you go about getting your first job after graduating? Particularly, I think, some of our undergrads might be, wondering about the process of applying and some of the things that might have been useful in getting you that first job.
Is that me again?
Yeah, let's go straight with you.
Okay,
Ella.
sorry. Yeah, so as I sort of touched on there, I applied to quite a few different things before I got my job. So I would say that's one important thing, is don't give up or feel too knocked back, because I did have quite a few setbacks. In the end, my first job, I worked in a primary school doing supporting children with autism and various learning needs. And I actually ended up getting that. I asked if I could volunteer, and then a job came up. So that's how I got that one. And then one thing I really would recommend, which is how I got my current job, I just signed up to a mailing list. So I would really recommend doing that if you can, if you're interested in something. I think it was for the CWP role. I don't know if people are familiar with that. It's a children wellbeing practitioner. And then when my role came up, they just emailed everyone who was interested. So I think that's quite a good way of staying on top of kinds of roles that are out there.
That's helpful. So Hugh, we heard about your computer science role in the department. What was your first job after the PhD?
Yeah, good question. So that then actually became a sort of fairly traditional approach. I did a 2-year postdoc fellowship in the States, looking at drug abuse and things like that, and then actually drug abuse. So that was really good to get abroad. And if you ever do get the chance to get a post abroad, I would thoroughly encourage you to do that, particularly earlier in your career when things are easy to be moved around and life experiences and things have more value and family commitments are probably lower. I then actually moved back to the UK after 3 years in the States and took up a position at University of Edinburgh and was in the psychology and neuroscience department, pharmacology groups there for just under 10 years. Doing drug discovery research and trying to understand learning and memory, those sorts of things, before I formally moved into pharma. So I didn't actually move into pharma until I was nearly 40. But many points in entry into research, and I would encourage you to get as much broad experience as you can before you settle down. That certainly has enabled me to survive in my research career, dapping around from different targets in different ways.
Thank you. So Claire, how did you get your first job?
I was in a similar position to Ella. I think I was looking for all sorts of things. The timing just happened to work out beautifully, where because I had started the application process sort of right around when I was wrapping up my thesis, because I knew these things can take time. I was able to get my diploma on a Friday, move to York on the weekend, and then start work on a Monday, which I maybe wouldn't recommend. But the job itself was, I was a research officer for a small charity, which was nationally commissioned, but I was working for a local branch. So it was called Health Watch North Yorkshire. And my job was sort of a public engagement. We were meant to be an independent body that was working with local healthcare providers, so clinical commissioning groups, and some of the wider regional bodies as well. And again, for me, it was largely about figuring out how to take the skills that I had learned and write that down in the language that would make sense for the people who were interviewing me. Because I was aware that some of the more, if I tried to put too much technical language, I guess, around the research that I was doing or the theory and stuff, it wouldn't mean anything. So there was some work that I went into, speaking to friends, speaking to people that I had networked with, kind of getting some help around what would make sense for someone who's reading this, and tell them that I'm capable of this job. I stayed in that role for almost 2 years, and I learned a lot. It was a lot of fun. I rode the bus a lot around North Yorkshire, speaking to all kinds of people about their experiences in healthcare, and then writing reports about that.
So sticking with you, Claire, was there then a very natural transition from that job to your current role in the DWP, or did you have to kind of reinvent yourself at that juncture?
So in a way, it was a really natural transition. A lot of the work that I was doing aligned beautifully with the behavioral science work, even though I didn't know it at the time. So I was sort of inadvertently speaking the language of the team when I sort of showed up to talk about the work that I had been doing. Because a lot of it is about understanding people's experiences and then sort of converting that to policy decisions. But there was definitely a transition in the sense that when I applied for the research officer role, I was very much in the space of, these are the skills that I have. I'm willing to sort of move in any space that will find these skills useful, because I think when you're new and you don't have a lot of experience under your belt, you do have to be flexible in that sense. But after 2 years of working for this organization, I was able to be a bit more choosy and go, okay, I unexpectedly, I didn't realize this, really enjoyed the policy element of this work and getting to learn about how decisions are structured to respond to the needs of citizens, and then how that impacts design of services. So that was sort of moving sideways into that role, but still being able to use some of the psychology work was a real blessing getting to join my current team.
Thank you. We've actually just had a question that Rose Stewart is interested in more specifics about your current role. So maybe it's a good timing to follow up. Actually, maybe you can tell us a little bit more about some of what you're doing with the DWP.
Yeah, of course. So there are quite a few departments now across government that do have behavioral science teams. They can look slightly different depending on the specifics of how many staff members there are and how much reach they have. So I can only really speak to the DWP specifically. But in our team, we're founded around this kind of challenge statement, I guess, which is that sometimes government makes decisions based on poor assumptions about human behavior. So what we do is we move through different areas of department, which is one of the things I love about my job, because I get to work in so many different areas, whether it's policy or delivery, or sometimes even in internal things like HR or finance. So we find collaborators and we help them to challenge their assumptions. We use sort of behavioral science models. We love Susan Michie's COM-B is one that we use all the time. And yeah, it's very sort of applied work where it's about translating some of the theory of what we learn in psychology and turning that into how do you think about writing a form, designing a job center, organizing a job search interview, doing your internal comms, organizing a promotion, a whole range of things. Kind of, if you can think about it, we like to say that, if you can apply a behavior to it, we're interested in being involved. So yeah, that's the kind of work that we do, and it's really interesting and something that I did not know existed before I applied for the team. So there's a lot more out there, I think, than people originally realized, or definitely, at least that I realized when thinking about where you can use some of those softer social psychology skills in a work context.
Thank you. Yeah, your boss now guest lectures for us on part 2 on PBS. Hopefully our current PBS students will be aware of some of these, although still very new directions in applying behavioral science to policy. Hugh, maybe along that theme of sort of reinventing yourself or realigning, I'd be particularly interested in that transition from Edinburgh to Pharma. Was that a sort of big change in your sort of work style and the types of goals you'd have to work towards?
It's an interesting question. In fact, my old supervisor in Cambridge actually thought I'd only got a proper job when I moved from academia into industry. So that was a bit of a change. Curiously, actually, I can do more academic psychology now in industry than I ever was able to do in academia. I've got more resources, I've got more capability to collaborate, those sorts of things. So actually the difference between industry and academic psychology or neuropsychology is not that different. In terms of changing with the times, yes, I think adaptability is really the only answer to maintaining something going the whole way through your career. My adaptability has been mainly shifting between the types of patients and disorders I'm trying to address, whether it's Alzheimer's in one case or brain cancer in another, or psychiatry more often than not. But there are other things that adapt. So for instance, at the moment, I'm actually going back to some of my very original psychology, cognitive learning theory notes, because we're trying to convert some of the ways that cognitive behavioral therapy are administered by the likes of Claire and Ella into a digital world, and actually trying to see if we can find digital therapeutics to move forward. So again, you can't stand still, or you turn into a block of stone or whatever. So yes, you do need to continually try and challenge and find new ways of doing it. But perhaps the other thing is that things always go round that come round. I don't think anybody else on the call is anywhere near as ancient and as grey as I am. But it really is quite surprising how many times I did something maybe 10 years or 15 years ago or 20 years ago, and suddenly it becomes really very important and very relevant that I can then knit that back into that story again and move forward. So it isn't just continual change for change's sake. It's often something that is just a cycle, and there are ups and downs as well, if that helps.
So I guess you see yourself as perhaps sort of innovating in new methods or maybe moving into different patient populations, but I guess basically working in the same sector.
Yeah, it's the same sector. As I said, I've always been interested in trying to find ways that we can find better therapies for patients. But a lot of that's technologically driven. Certainly when I was an undergraduate and then graduate student in Cambridge, we reviewed the brain as a black box. We didn't have MRI scanners. We didn't have high quality EEG. All we really had was the ability to ask a question and find out what you got back. So actually looking at the individual or the animal in my case was what you did. And then as time's moved on, then we now have new technologies available so we can do scanning and EEG. And I'm sure in Claire and Ella's worlds, that as the digital world moves on, things change a little bit. I've been interested very recently in a working group where we're actually trying to work out what the impact of COVID on the psychological status of people are. We're all now doing Zoom meetings, these sorts of things. We actually can see the incidence of depression is increasing, the incidence of social with isolation is increasing, but how can we build things to do things better? So actually what you're doing here this evening with the alumni event, doing it virtually, it's maybe not ideal, but on the other hand, you can get people from 7 countries and the whole planet engaging, whereas if we were doing it in a lovely room in Hall, then maybe that wouldn't be quite so easy. So there are always pluses and minuses.
Indeed. Although, yeah, I hope to see many of you in a lovely room in Hall sometime in the near future. I can Sorry, Hugh.
No, go ahead. Sorry.
I can empathise with that question about when you're going to get a proper job. My dad continues to ask me when will I get a proper job. I'm not sure when he'll stop asking that. Ella, I guess there's quite a logical progression from your undergrad to what you're doing now. Do you see yourself as pretty stable in this role? Do you imagine this is something you're going to be doing for a long time in your career?
Yeah, possibly, but I think I still have that same attitude that I had when I started, which was just kind of go in whatever direction feels good, really. So I think I'll probably stay here for a little while, but maybe aim to go and train as a proper therapist. When I grow up, I'll be a proper therapist. Yeah, or maybe I'm also really interested in mindfulness, and so I've thought about maybe going into teaching mindfulness. So yeah, there's a couple of directions that I'm kind of reflecting on a bit, but yeah.
And sticking with you, Ella, what would you say in your sort of actual day-to-day experience now of your job? Like, what do you think are some of the most helpful skills that you've learned in your undergrad that have transferred to your working context?
Yeah, I think having the brilliant supervision at Cambridge is a really good transferable skill, because in my role we have regular supervision with our clinical work, so kind of having that ability to really reflect on yourself and what you've done, whether that's obviously as in essay writing at uni or whether that's client work in my role, that ability to kind of really look at yourself and be quite honest with yourself, I think is really useful. Let me just check, because I wrote some down for this question. It's a little bit more complex, isn't it, than the others? Theory to practice as well, I put is quite an interesting one, I guess. Kind of thinking, well, how do you transfer what you learn in terms of the theories like CBT and all that stuff into when you're sat there with a young person in a room? And I think my advice on that is you just have to do it. You just kind of have to jump in, and I think the more you've kind of read and the more breadth of knowledge that you've picked up, you just end up kind of noticing those patterns in the clients that you work with. And so I think that's quite a hands-on sort of one. You don't have to worry too much about it, I would say. If you've got the kind of knowledge and the interest there in all the different theories and psychological approaches, when you sit down with people, it just kind of happens and you notice it. Yeah, I think that's kind of what I would say to that one.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point about supervision, because I think when you're here, you maybe just see it as part of the mechanics of how you're taught, but actually there is an element in which that interaction sort of encourages a degree of introspection and the ability to communicate effectively in a small group. So That's interesting to think about that as a transferable skill in its own right.
Yeah.
So yeah, Claire, what would you say is sort of transferred most for you in your current work?
I think that one of the most valuable things that I learned both from my undergrad and from my master's, specifically in psychology, was this idea that not only do you have to have a grasp on your ideas and then your theory, you have to understand the groundwork of what's come before you and develop your own hypotheses. You also have to be able to communicate them to others, which sounds like such a basic thing, but can be an incredible next step to learn. It's a skill. So whether that becomes writing a thesis where you are using quite technical language frequently, where it's for a very, very specific audience, you can keep in mind that you can expect a certain level of knowledge from the people who will be reading, right down to maybe you are sharing a poster at a presentation or a conference where you have no guarantee that the person who is reading this material will even know anything about psychology. So when you kind of move into the working world, there is this, it's necessary to learn how to, I don't really want to use the word simplify, because you're not necessarily dumbing it down, but you do have to learn to adapt to different levels of base knowledge. And I don't think it's something that we consciously consider ourselves as learning in our school setting, but really, really valuable nonetheless. So whether you're learning to communicate consent, for example, to participate in an experiment to someone who's maybe never done this before, versus trying to convince your colleagues of a theory and they're really well versed and ready to rip your ideas to shreds. Sort of that idea that you have to be able to scale up and scale down based on your audience, make a judgment about where they're likely to be at and match accordingly, has been something that's been really useful in the roles that I've taken on since university.
That's really interesting. You mentioned something earlier as well about presenting your skill set in a way that would be sort of understood in another area. I thought that was quite an interesting insight as well.
It's surprisingly challenging, I think, because it requires you to step into the shoes of somebody else. You sometimes have to make some assumptions and you can do your best to test those, whether it's through looking at the material that they might have on their recruitment, for example, or their websites or blogs, if you're lucky enough to be trying to get hired somewhere where you can find the people on social media or LinkedIn or something. But it's around, trying to make sure that you're speaking on a level. And I think that's actually, now that I'm really thinking about it, also something that I have to do because both of the roles that I've done have been very consultancy, essentially. So in the case of the DWP, we're sort of an internal consultancy. And in the third sector as well, we were operating externally to the major systems. So you can have fantastic ideas and it will not matter at all if no one wants to listen to them or can understand them. So doing things like building rapport, which I imagine is a big part of what Ella does as well, and learning to meet the person where they're at is big. And I think that started in university.
I think there can also be a kind of big, vocabulary barrier that you very quickly forget that words that are very intuitive to you aren't intuitive to others, and that also actually people might use slightly different words to you in a different context, and you do need to adapt your vocabulary a little bit to sort of communicate across different disciplines. And
I think in government, that's a particular struggle because there's a very specific language when you work in government, and people can become really attuned to sort of very I know I can make this joke because we laugh about it internally all the time, how it's just peppered with jargon and acronyms, and you really have to take a step back and remind yourself that sure, we tell people that we're going to assess them for benefit based on these criteria, and our staff live and breathe these criteria, so they make inherent sense to them. Whereas to the average person who's filling out a form, preparing your food versus eating is probably not going to be a really meaningful distinction when you ask them to describe their behaviors and separating both. So it's the language challenge is a big one when you need to create a universal way of communicating that is straightforward, accessible, but also specific.
We also had a question from Elizabeth about how you actually found out about the role you currently have? Maybe you could answer that, and how the DWP or indeed government currently advertises for behavioural science roles.
So all of the jobs are advertised under civil service jobs. They're all sort of universally. The government has really strict processes for how you can be hired, and the system of going through and being recruited. So that is where the application will go through. There's sort of a portal that you access. I specifically actually found out about this job because a friend of a friend was connected to Laura de Moyer, who, of course, I know you know as well, Lee, who's now leading her own team out of Cabinet Office. And they were connected on LinkedIn. So he sent the advertisement to me and said, "Oh, this sounds like something you might be interested in." So I know that whenever an advertisement goes up, I see a flurry of sort of LinkedIn notifications of various sort of, you know, whether it's the Treasury or whether it's Department of Education. You'll sort of see people sharing them because we want the best talent. We want to sort of reach the widest pool we can and get the best applicants. So some of those social networks definitely exist.
So I guess in the first place, being on LinkedIn, maybe.
Yeah. But yeah, also just looking at civil service jobs is the main. If you put behavioral science or behavioral scientist.
So you can filter because I'd imagine if you look for civil service jobs in general, you'll get an avalanche of positions that you can filter for sort of behavioral science.
Yes, and sometimes they're called behavioral insights. So there's a couple of, usually if you put in behavioral, you'll get the sort of psychology related job. That's sort of the key word to be looking for in government at the moment. Or thinking of Hugh's background in a more sort of computer and technical space, things like UX design as well, I think have a lot of demand potentially for psychology backgrounds where you're thinking about user journeys and that kind of thing in a digital context. There's a lot of recruitment for that in government as well. And I imagine in private industry, but I know about government, so.
Yeah, some good friends of mine recently left academic jobs for user research jobs at Facebook. So that's definitely a trend as well. Hugh, I guess yours is a different context in moving from a PhD, but how would you reflect on some of the skills that you've learned as a psychologist have been useful?
Just reflecting on what Claire and Ella have been saying, I think the communication part is actually a very strong one. And certainly being able to explain complex principles in simple language is incredibly important, whatever walk of life you're in. Even these days, where I'm fairly senior in a large organization, being able to go to other parts of the organization who may have nothing to do with what I'm doing, but I need to persuade them to provide me with funding or support, being able to break an idea down into something smaller and easier to work with is very good. I think you'd be surprised how many soft skills studying psychology teaches you. Knowing a little bit about how people structure their thoughts, how the mind works, does actually probably enable you to understand people's reactions on occasions. It may even help you guide a particular conversation down a route that you want it to go, so you'll end up with the conclusion you want because you've been able to think out some sort of psychological strategy as to how you're going to get there. So you don't really realize you're picking up on those sorts of things, but being able to read people, understand them, empathize with them, read their emotions, none of that is to be sniffed at. It's all very, very good, strong stuff. The other part that I'd probably add in is never be frightened to carry on learning. I've been at this game a long time, and there is always something new coming along. There'll be a new idea, a new hypothesis, a new technology, a new way of doing something. Never be frightened to go back and do a course, or maybe try for a job that doesn't quite fit what you think you can do, because it's surprising that once you've actually got the basic nuts and bolts of being able to acquire information, look at it critically, come up with a new idea and move forward. I would imagine both Ella and Claire find it as well. That's a basic skill that you'll be picking up now, whether it's undergraduate or postgraduate. That skill will be there for the rest of your life as long as you practice it. And that will enable you to move from one domain to another, or if the particular area you're working in dries up and you want to move to a new area, you can continue to learn. And the only other bit I would say is I've actually been very lucky. I've been able to keep a bit of teaching going all the way through my career. And actually, one of the quickest way of learning is teaching. Maybe Lee yourself, you might actually be able to sympathise with that. I've actually learned more probably through teaching than I ever did being taught. So also give yourself a chance to get involved in these sorts of events. These aren't quite as interactive as perhaps they are more traditionally, but getting involved with people, that's a great way of learning new ways of doing things and using your psychology skills in a teaching mode as well as in a learning mode.
Yeah, I can definitely recognise that. I spent 5 years postdocing, and then my first year of teaching was actually at UCL, and yeah, I felt like I learned more that year at UCL than I had in the 5 years of postdocing, or sort of more knowledge. I think I learned lots of skills in the postdoc, but sort of my knowledge expanded rapidly, having to teach lots of content. Yeah, that's a really interesting point also about the kind of soft skills of working with people and navigating groups. There's, they don't call it office politics for nothing. That, wherever you get groups of people, we like forming into, groups which have their own rivalries and suspicions about what other groups are doing, and some insights into that. It's interesting that you said you found that valuable.
Very much so. Very much so.
So actually, I'll jump to Rose's question next as to whether any of you have any ideas or advice about how to go about finding out about interesting roles or positions that are out there, but that might not necessarily be that obvious.
I think one of the things that I really found is that, and this is one of those, positives and negatives things where it's a trade-off, but my experience is that when you work for a very small organization, you will end up pitching in with a little bit of everything. Whereas when you work for a big one, you end up becoming quite specialized very quickly. So if you can see an organization that you'd like to work with, so in terms of, for example, if you're interested in working for the third sector or around a specific field or subject, if it's a very small one, you will almost inevitably start learning about what's happening in all parts of the organization. And this was something that I stumbled into quite accidentally. But my first, the team that I joined at HealthWatch was four people, 4.5 people if you count the part-time. And it meant that I was suddenly learning an enormous amount of things about stakeholder engagement and local government, comms and engagement, sort of various strategy, things that I wouldn't have picked up if I worked for a very big organization where I ended up quite siloed. So that's not a direct answer about how to find interesting roles, but sometimes, again, I don't know how people come up with names for these specific jobs. Often they'll all be named really, they'll have 4 different names for what is essentially the same job. But in some ways, if you're able to say, I want to work with that organization, and then keep looking at what they're offering, that's one way to start, because yes, it can be enormously overwhelming. In hindsight, there are a lot of things that I could have done in the third sector around things like engagement, stakeholder management, things like collaboration roles, relationship manager roles, those kinds of things. I would have had the skill set to do, but I would not have known that looking at the title itself. So in some levels, I think you have to try and talk to people who are in those organizations if you can, and get some advice from what's newest, because I imagine that will change as well. That what, I imagine that my job title wouldn't be the same if I stayed in the same role for a decade. Although I do work for Carla, and her reasoning for why she named us what she did was very solid. So maybe I still would be a behavioral science advisor. But I know that's not often the case in the civil service anyway.
Hugh, Ella, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I think we've got in Ella and Claire, you're really both in the public sector, and Lee, you're still in the academic sector. If you do get a chance to work in industry, please do, even if you only do it for a year or two. What I think you'll find in industry is you'll probably find a job on LinkedIn or wherever that will get you in the door. And your skills and qualities will get you that job to start with. But what you'll find is that within particularly a large company, there are a huge number of roles that you'll never even conceive exist. There is no work seminar that you could go to that could describe all those jobs, and you won't really know what some of them are. Most of the big companies have good programs where you can get experience in different departments, doing different roles, moving between roles. Actually, within the company I'm working at the moment, 70% of our positions are filled internally, and then interdepartmental moves, and people move around. In fact, we deliberately and actively encourage people to take on different roles. Even within my own department, if somebody comes in with a PhD, they'll move into one particular group, but over the next 5 years, I will deliberately move them between different ways that we work. So we've got lab bench-based jobs, we've got jobs working with the external world, we've got work with the regulators, all of these sorts of things. And by going into industry, you'll see that there is a whole range of opportunities. And that then might give you the beginning of a rather wiggly bit of string that will keep you going all the way through as you move from company to company or within a company. So don't forget about the commercial sector.
I do have to say the internal transition is true for the civil service as well. And I do have friends who have sort of tried to get a foot in the door and then move sideways, because sometimes positions are only advertised internally as well. And I would suspect that's the case for everywhere. So sometimes it's about getting in. Just
get in, get through the door, and then life's a lot easier. Hello.
Ella, did you have any thoughts on?
Yeah, sorry, my internet dropped out.
You could get back.
Are we still on the question of how to find interesting or different kind of roles?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, I don't know if I have much more to add. I think maybe also just kind of good old fashioned, like talking to people and family, friends, linking in with people at Cambridge, obviously, as you all are here doing today. I think that's probably what ended up kind of expanding my idea of what was out there, because it can all feel just really like huge and unknown. But like what both Hugh and Claire said, I think once you're there, once you're kind of in with an organisation, you can really get to know roles in a way that you might not have been able to do from the outside. So like, for example, in my role, we're a really multidisciplinary team. So we've got a clinical nurse, we've got family therapist, art therapist, systemic practitioner. So from there, just from getting to know people, I've got a much better idea of what I may or may not want to do. So I think I agree with that, getting into a team if you can. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I was thinking, because Claire, you said one of your jobs was recommended by a friend in LinkedIn, and I was thinking of my own experience that actually I think most of the jobs I've got have actually been ones that friends have pointed out to me. So yeah, I think having peers who kind of know what you're interested in means there's sort of more people scouring Twitter and LinkedIn and whatever for jobs that you might not see, who can perhaps recommend them to you.
And that particular friend was actually a part of my graduate cohort. So yeah, your classmates can become your allies as you all sort of look to move into jobs.
So our final pre-organized question is whether you have any advice that you might go back and give to yourself if you were a student now or just about to graduate. You may have already shared a lot of your wisdom, but maybe there's something you'd like to reiterate or something you'd like to express, also a bit maybe on the sort of personal level of going about approaching this sort of transition from undergraduate to working life.
Shall I go first?
Sure, Claire.
I think listening to Hugh as well has especially reminded me of the way that when I was in my undergraduate, I don't know where I got this from, or whether it was just because the cumulative impact of exams and listening to professors talk about how important this part of my life was had sort of given me an overinflated sense of how urgent it was to have it figured out. But I remember really having this sense that, I had to pick something. And then once I picked something, it was going to be picked. So I had to pick soon, and it was a commitment. And then I moved into the working world and realized that people change all the time. and that you can start in something and then pivot. And it's an unusual person now, I think, who sits in a role for decades and decades. So it's not to say that it isn't still a big decision and it can be overwhelming. I'm not minimizing the impact of that at all. But I do wish I could go back and gently put my own hand on my shoulder and say, just calm down a little bit. It's okay. If you don't figure this out the first time, there's going to be other chances.
I can't agree with you more, Claire, actually. I actually did take a little while to get going. I could actually even say probably I've only just got my dream job now. I'm in my late 50s. So give yourself time. As long as you're doing something that's interesting and exciting and the people around you are good fun to be with, that's a good place to be. You'll be enjoying your life. You'll be doing something that's useful. You'll probably be learning something. You'll be gaining life experience. You'll be becoming more resilient. You're able to do things better. I think the only thing I'd say is if you do land up somewhere and you're hating it, you really don't like the course you're on, you don't like the place you're living, you don't like the people you're working with, or the job isn't what you thought it was, then don't persevere doing something which is not fun. Everybody who's on this call has got an intellect which should be able to take you somewhere interesting in life. Use that intellect and just try and make your life as fun, as creative as you possibly can. Don't get stuck in a rut. Keep moving.
Also, strange skills that you don't expect will sometimes loop back to becoming useful. I spent a lot of my undergraduate degree procrastinating with art, and now I draw little cartoons for the team that go in our various presentations that get given. I think one of them got put in front of the G20 summit in Saudi Arabia last year. So it's, you never know what's going to end up being useful.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's a tough speech to follow, Hugh. I loved what you said there. I think it is like, I would say, just be really patient with yourself, take your time thinking what you want to do, but also maybe just try something, and then, like you said, if it doesn't work, don't be afraid to make a change. And I think also just be really kind to yourself, because I don't know if people relate to this, but I think sometimes with Cambridge we can have this, like, because we're at kind of 100 miles an hour when we're there, and it's just, it's amazing, but it's intense. Sometimes there can be that pressure to kind of maybe have to keep that up afterwards. And I know a lot of people kind of joke about the idea of imposter syndrome and like, am I qualified to be here? Am I supposed to be here? And I think I can say from personal experience, I sometimes still get that from being somewhere where there's such high expectation. And so I think just be really kind to yourself around that, and know that it's okay if you're kind of struggling with some of those feelings as well. I think it's really normal. So that's what I would say as well.
Perhaps the other one is, if you do start something new, I just advise you shouldn't stick with it if you don't like it, but do give it 4 to 6 months, because something new, if it's worth doing, it's going to take you a little while to learn it. I've stepped up in my current role. I took it on just over a year ago. I'm about a year in, and I'm just beginning to get the nuts and bolts of it sorted out. And it'll probably be another year or 18 months before I've got it really nailed, and I'm sort of running on an even keel and I can get everything I want to do. Even daft things like I never knew German. I didn't do German at school, and I'm in late 50s and I'm trying to learn a second language properly for the first time. So hopefully the old theory is that you'll become less cognitively plastic as you get older, and not quite so true for me. But do just keep trying things and give them a chance before you give up on them. But perhaps might be a slight caveat to what I said.
I found alcohol helped with me learning Dutch. Hugh, if that's any advice. I was going to also reiterate that advice you gave earlier about which I can see now also as I'm getting older, that you do have more flexibility at a younger age to go, work in a different country, or just try something really unusual, and that the flexibility and freedom to do that does get a little bit more complicated as you get older. So that's something I might emphasize as well. I was just reflecting on this for myself as well, and I think I've also had that sense that Claire was talking about, of that, you know, intense, so I've got to make the right choice, and, you know, I've got to make it now. That's also been in the back of my mind for a long time. And I think for me also something that was very helpful, that procrastination for me has revolved a lot about whether I want to be in academia or whether I want to be in politics. That's two things I'm very passionate about, and I felt very torn over. And I found it extremely helpful actually going and working full-time for a political party for 6 months. That made me realize I didn't want to be involved and return to the safe ivory towers of academia. I'm still very interested in politics. But yeah, I think the actual, you know, you can procrastinate forever in your head about different options that might be available to you. And I think actually sometimes dipping your toe and allowing yourself to just experience and, you know, maybe learn that it isn't the right choice, but giving it a good shot for, you know, 6 months or so can be very valuable.
Making the odd mistake is the quickest way of learning, as cognitive neuropsychology teaches.
Yeah.
When you get it right, you don't actually know why you got it right. When you get it wrong, you can probably work it out. So that, I remember, that's a very nice example. You tried it, you worked out why you didn't like it, and have moved in a different direction.
Yeah, there were dynamics about the daily experience of it that I couldn't have known I wouldn't like the experience of until I was doing it. So,
which is actually part of the reason why I ended up not pursuing clinical psychology. Towards the end of my degree, I was able to get some relevant volunteering experience. And I think that can be a way to dip your toe in as well, when you're able to try things on a short term. And I didn't get the 4 to 6 months of giving it a try, but I think I knew fairly early on that dispositionally this was not going to be a good fit for me. And when you can find that out early, rather than before I had committed to the 5 years in North America that it is to do a clinical psychology degree, that's good. That's a good thing.
Very good.
Yeah, I think that element also of the dispositional fit, that actually I think sometimes you can take it very personally when you don't necessarily get a role that you go for, but actually, you know, you might be brilliantly suited for some other role that you haven't quite found yet. And so I think not taking things too personally, I think we have this way of simplistically ranking everything in, you know, ranking league tables and trying to compete with have league tables of colleges. We sort of like everything being on a linear line of, you know, ability. But I've seen so many graduates, you know, really frustrated at not getting a couple of jobs that they go for and thinking it means they're terrible. And then, you know, a couple of months later, they've got this dream job somewhere that they're super happy with. So I think recognizing that there's a question of sort of fit between you and a role that doesn't necessarily mean you're not as good as other people, but it just means people are assessing, you know, the fit for particular roles in particular companies.
There's this quote that I heard a while ago that I'm no doubt quoting someone really famous and making myself a fool for not remembering where it comes from, but it basically went that good luck is a combination of preparation and timing. And I think in some ways it is about, you have to be ready for that lightning to strike, and it might never, you know, that genuinely is luck, but you can be ready for an opportunity if it lands, and you can be looking for them. So it's a little bit of both, I think.
If you are occasionally not getting as far as you want to in terms of getting the interviews and whatever, then the only other thing is sometimes maybe be a little bit self-introspective. If there is a skill that clearly you think that each time you go to an interview and somebody asks you, can you do this? And you say, well, no, really, I can't. Don't, as I said earlier, don't be frightened about going and doing a little bit of extra learning. If you need a bit of computer programming, or you need a bit of understanding about finance, or you need a bit of understanding about something, going and getting a little bit of extra training, or finding a part-time job that gives you that experience. An employer will always give you credit for the fact you're trying to build your capability as you move forward, and having evidence for that is great. So yeah, don't be frightened about actively learning, because it's going to be making your life far more exciting and rewarding as you pick up new skills and capabilities.
I guess that's also one of the kind of implicit skills in the Cambridge approach, that, you know, you get thrown into a new paper and are rapidly having to write new essay questions on it. And so the ability to rapidly acquire a degree of competence in a new area is something that you should be well placed for. Does anybody have any questions? They haven't. We've only got a couple of minutes left, so I do just want to check someone's not holding back on some questions that they'd like to ask. Cool. Okay. Looks, hopefully we've addressed all of your questions in the discussion then. It was a wonderful exploration, lovely having some slightly different trajectories to explore. I certainly learned a lot as well, so I hope all of you did as well. Rochelle, did you want to say something to wrap up?
Just to say again, echo a huge thanks to the panel. I think that was really helpful and inspirational for our audience. Just to remind everyone as well, we do have our online community, so you can network with each other. So that's a link hall, so www.linkhall.org. So do reach out to people on there as well. We've got more online events coming up. Keep an eye on your email and the website, and further details will be coming your way. But in the meantime, a huge thank you to Ella, to Claire, to Hugh for sharing all their insight and experiences, and a huge thank you to Lee for chairing, and to Eleno behind the scenes for all the organisation, and of course thank you to you for joining, and we will hopefully see you at another event, either online or fingers crossed back in college again soon. Thank you all.